Hey, grade 10. Today we are going into lesson 4 on our climate change unit. Today, this is some of the content that you guys will be using for your group presentations. So let's go ahead and get started. Today, we are going to be looking specifically at the impacts of climate change on Earth and also on humans. And this is all an effort to work on our criterion C. You all will be doing group presentations on one of these impacts, and the aim is to be able to share this information that you're going to learn deeper about in a clear and engaging way. So again, I will always give you guys reminders about criterion A. Feel free to pause it, take a little read, and also criterion C, especially for this one, communicating. This information is just like a general broad overview on the impacts. So you and your group are going to do deeper, more meaningful research on this. So impacts of climate change on the Earth and humans. These are the 5 elements that we're going to be examining. So you and your group will have one of them, but it's a good idea to have a general understanding of each and take in that holistic perspective of how this is affecting different elements, right? So the first one, sea levels and water systems, then extreme weather events. 3, ecosystems and biodiversity. 4, agriculture and food security. And then finally, people and politics. So for this first one, sea levels and water systems. So this is a big one, right? As temperatures rise, that causes the melting of glaciers, the melting of polar ice, which then in turn causes that sea level rise. So what does this mean? What kind of impacts does this have? A few of the most notable ones include coastal erosion, inundation of low-lying areas. In other words, these areas can definitely get flooded easily, and also loss of habitable land. So losing land to that rising sea level. Also, as the sea level rises, this means that storm surges become far more serious and damaging. Flooding is much easier to happen in different areas where maybe that wasn't the case before. When there's floods, right, when there's a lot of storm surges, it damages our infrastructure, which, if we think about economically, that is very expensive, not just in the damage and having to rebuild, but also in the opportunity cost of not being able to function normally. Also, another huge implication of this is the displacement of populations. People have to leave, right? If infrastructure is damaged, then they might not be able to live there until there's been enough repairs. Saltwater intrusion can also contaminate freshwater sources. So as sea levels rise, that can get into various freshwater supplies. That includes drinking water supplies and also water for agriculture. And that also has more implications on people as well as on our crops. Next, we have extreme weather events. So as climate change continues, the frequency and severity of extreme weather continues to happen, right? So this can take many forms, right? These are just a few, some of the notable ones here: hurricanes, cyclones, droughts, heavy rainfall, so many other ones, right? But not having that typical range of weather and seeing more often the extremes is definitely one of the big impacts. Ultimately, this can lead to a lot of different things, notably property damage, infrastructure damage, loss of life. That's a big one, right? Like the implication for how this affects humans and our societies, and also disruptions to communities, infrastructure, and economies. Then we have ecosystems and biodiversity. So ecosystems can be very vulnerable, can be very delicate, especially as climate change continues to get worse, right? That vulnerability increases. So this means that shifts in habitat can cause a disruption to these species, which can then lead to even more serious issues for these different species of plants and animals. Rising temperatures have caused things like coral bleaching, damaging coral reefs and marine biology. So this is not just limited to our ecosystem and biodiversity on land, but also within the sea. Habitats may change faster than some species can adapt or migrate. So having that change in environment is something that animals are actually pretty good at dealing with, but usually that change is slow over a long period of time, and adaptation is so much easier. However, because of the speed that climate change has been happening, that's not as possible for these animal and plant populations. So eventually, these populations begin to decline and potentially become extinct, which we have already seen. Then we have agriculture and food security. So these changing climate patterns can disrupt agricultural seasons. Some of the implications that has is reduced crop yields. So just not being able to produce the typical amount of food that we're able to. And that decreased food production also has implications, right? How are we supposed to be able to get that where if we have food shortages, prices will increase, right? Another element to this is if there's extreme weather events that damage crops, that's going to be the same result, food shortages and price increases. Pests and diseases can also spread to other areas that maybe they weren't able to survive before as temperatures change. And that absolutely also affects crop health and productivity. So again, we can see a lot of different implications for agriculture and then being able to have a steady and adequate access to food supply. And finally, we have people and politics. So for this one, there's so many different things we can talk about here, but here are some of the main ones. It can exacerbate existing social and economic inequalities. So essentially, it disproportionately affects vulnerable communities. So the people that are, most affected, they're the ones that are typically maybe living in poverty, right? Maybe not having enough access to resources as it is. So the ones that are least able to be able to deal with some of these changes, unfortunately, are often the ones that are most affected. Migration and displacement, having climate refugees, having people have to move even if it's temporarily, can occur because of climate-related issues. So that can cause social tensions and can also pose challenges for host communities for some of these climate refugees. International politics can also be influenced by climate concerns, right? So negotiations over CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, right? Methane, anything along those lines, can be issues between countries, right? There's a lot of reduction targets, and then also the finance element, right? The element of who's going to be funding this, right? Who's going to be paying in order for us to deal with climate change? That's another big question that causes international tensions. So those are the 5 main things that each group is going to be looking at. Keep in mind, these are very general takeaways for you guys, just to have a base of understanding. Make sure that as you all are doing your research, you're getting into more of the details, looking at evidence, looking at a variety of legitimate sources, bringing in examples, right? Moving forward, the next thing we're going to be talking about is mitigation and adaptation. So just as a little preview, these impacts are being addressed, right? Different strategies can include building resilient infrastructure that can deal with some of the more extreme weather. Also, early warning systems, things like drought-resistant crops. These are just a few examples. So that will be coming up after our presentations. So thank you guys, and I look forward to seeing everybody's research.